Long before Yharnam had a name, before its cathedrals rose or its cobblestones were laid, something vast and formless drifted into the world and chose, for reasons no human mind was built to hold, to stay, and that arrival is where our story begins. If you're new here, consider subscribing, because we're about to walk the entire span of Bloodborne's timeline, from its coldest origins to its final ambiguous dawn, and there is a great deal of ground to cover before we're done. The Great Ones, as they came to be called by the few who survived contact with them, did not arrive as conquerors or gods in the traditional sense. They simply existed, alien intelligences from somewhere outside ordinary space, and their presence alone was enough to reshape whatever they touched. Some of them, we're told, eventually chose to abandon physical form entirely, ascending into something closer to pure concept or pure will, no longer bound by flesh or by the rules that flesh obeys. This detail, tucked away in item descriptions rather than stated outright, suggests a hierarchy among the Great Ones that the rest of the game only lets us glimpse in fragments. Others stayed behind. Whether by choice, by failure, or by some logic entirely outside human categories, a portion of these beings remained tethered to physical existence, sleeping in vast subterranean spaces or drifting at the edges of perception, waiting for something none of us can fully name. It's worth sitting with that distinction for a moment, because it shapes everything that comes after. An ascended Great One is gone, functionally mythic, spoken of only in rumor, while an unascended one is still here, still reachable, still capable of being disturbed by whoever is curious enough to go looking. Into this early, half-lit world stepped a civilization we now call the Pthumerians, a people whose name survives mostly through ruin and rumor, but whose fingerprints are all over the game's oldest and deepest spaces. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Chalice dungeons and notice how thoroughly they were built as tombs first and dwellings second. The Pthumerians were not simple caretakers stumbling blindly into contact with something greater than themselves. They were, by every surviving account, guardians, a people who took on the sacred and dangerous duty of watching over the Great Ones that had chosen to remain asleep in the earth beneath them. This wasn't idol worship, it was structural, woven into the architecture of their entire civilization, the sprawling network of tombs and passages we later come to know simply as the Labyrinth, built specifically to house and contain these slumbering entities. The Pthumerians treated this task with the gravity of a people who understood, at least in part, what they were dealing with. Through generations of proximity to this duty, they developed knowledge that no other civilization in the game's lore seems to have possessed in quite the same depth. The mystical arts of fire came first, but more importantly came the arts of blood, an obsession that would eventually outlive the Pthumerians themselves and pass down, mutated and misunderstood, into the hands of the humans who came centuries after. It's easy to read the Pthumerians as monstrous, given how we meet their descendants deep in the Chalice dungeons, twisted and hollow-eyed. But the deeper text suggests something sadder, a people who got so close to a truth too large for them that the closeness itself became a kind of erosion. They built great cities to house this knowledge and this duty. Ihol rose as perhaps the grandest of these, a seat of power and ritual that would later lend its name to the deepest and most dangerous of the Chalice dungeon chains players can descend into. Lauren grew alongside it, a city whose fate would end up entwined with something far darker than mere decline, and Iz completed this trio of ancient settlements, each one a testament to how thoroughly the Pthumerians had built their civilization around the sleeping gods beneath their feet. What's striking, looking back at this era with everything we now know, is how quietly it all seems to have functioned for so long. There's no record of catastrophe in these early centuries, no single moment of rupture. Just a civilization going about the slow work of guardianship. Generation after generation, the Pthumerians grew, we can infer, more knowledgeable and more entangled with the very things they were meant to be protecting the world from. That entanglement would not stay contained forever, and the first true crack in it did not take long to appear once it started. It was in Lauren, of all the great Pthumerian cities, that this crack first appeared, though whether it was a crack in a wall or a crack in something deeper is hard to say with any real certainty, given how little survives from this period. Lauren became the site of the first known emergence of what the game calls the Scourge of the Beast, a transformation that turns ordinary people into something feral, something no longer entirely human, driven by an unnatural hunger that consumes both body and mind alike. We don't know exactly what triggered it in Lauren specifically. One possible reading is that proximity to the Great Ones, sustained across enough generations, simply wears away at whatever keeps a person recognizably a person. And Lauren was always going to be ground zero for that kind of unraveling. Another possible reading, and one the game seems to gesture toward more directly, ties the Scourge to the rise of something called the Blood Moon, an event and a presence that may in fact be one and the same thing, wearing two entirely different faces. The lore is genuinely ambiguous here, and it's worth being honest about that ambiguity, rather than smoothing it over for the sake of a tidier story. We don't know for certain whether the Blood Moon's rise caused the Scourge to spread through Lauren, or the reverse. It's equally possible that the mass transformation of Lauren's people into beasts was itself what summoned the Blood Moon into visibility for the first time, a chicken and egg problem the game seems content to leave unresolved, rather than hand us a clean answer. What we do know is that the Blood Moon, whatever its exact relationship to causation, is understood to be an aspect or a facet of a great one that would later become known more directly to us as the Moon Presence, a name that will echo across this entire video. This is one of those quiet details that rewards a second look. The same entity, or something intimately related to it, appears to manifest in at least two distinct forms across the game's history: a crimson lunar phenomenon in one context, and a directly encountered being in another. That thread runs all the way from Lauren's ancient collapse to the final rooftop confrontation that closes out the entire game many centuries later, and keeping it in mind now will make that later chapter land with considerably more weight when we finally reach it. It was in this same chaotic period, as Lauren's people transformed and the Blood Moon rose over the ancient world for what may have been the very first time, that the last known Pthumerian queen enters the story in earnest, and her name deserves particular attention. Her name was Yharnam, and it's worth pausing on that name, because centuries later an entire city, an entire cathedral choked. Blood-soaked metropolis would be built and named in her honor by people who likely understood almost nothing of who she actually was. Queen Yharnam, in the chaos of this collapsing Pthumerian world, became pregnant, and the game's lore is fairly direct in attributing this pregnancy to the Great Ones themselves, rather than to any ordinary act of succession or dynasty building among her own people. This wasn't framed as an honor in any straightforward sense. It reads more like an intrusion, a consequence of a civilization that had drawn so close to these alien beings that the boundary between guardian and vessel had effectively dissolved somewhere along the way. The child born from this union was an infant great one who would come to be known by the name Murgo. And his birth did not go the way any birth is meant to go, in this world or perhaps in any world at all. Murgo did not survive it, at least not in the waking world, not in the world of flesh and breath and physical consequence that the rest of us occupy day to day. And yet survival, for a being whose nature already exists partly outside conventional physical rules, doesn't necessarily mean what we'd expect. Murgo's alien consciousness, we're told, persisted, carried forward not through his mother's body or through any ordinary continuity, but through something the game calls the Dreamlands, a separate register of existence where the rules of death and birth don't quite apply as they should. This detail matters enormously for everything that follows. Centuries later, an entire cult, an entire scholarly obsession, would form around the singular goal of reaching Murgo, of gaining an audience with a great one who technically died before he was ever fully born into our world. That obsession would eventually cost an untold number of lives to even approach, let alone satisfy. And it's a strange kind of legacy for an infant who, in the waking world, never took a single breath of air or opened his eyes even once. The fall of the Pthumerian civilization that follows this period isn't documented as a single dramatic collapse in the way we might expect from a more conventional myth. There's no last battle, no final siege recorded anywhere in the game's surviving texts or item descriptions. What we get instead is closer to erosion, a society, having built its entire cultural and spiritual identity around the guardianship of the Great Ones, gradually losing itself to the very forces it was meant to contain in the first place, slowly, and then all at once. The later generations of Pthumerians, based on what item descriptions and inscriptions in the deepest Chalice dungeons suggest, drifted from the humility of their earliest guardians into something more entitled, more willing to claim leadership over knowledge their ancestors approached with far greater caution. Their arcane arts, once a careful discipline passed down with reverence, began to degenerate under the weight of this shift. Their society, once organized around service to something greater, began to rely more and more heavily on blood itself as a raw source of power. This shift reads, in hindsight, as an eerie foreshadowing of everything the Healing Church would later become. Centuries after the Pthumerians themselves had faded into ruin and legend, as though history in this world is fated to repeat its own worst mistakes. Ailing Loren, the same city where the Scourge first emerged, was eventually overrun entirely, its people consumed by the very beasthood that had first taken root there, leaving behind a labyrinth of bone and ruin that later explorers would find, and would very much come to regret. And so the ancient world, the world of Ihil and Loren and Is, of guardian queens and sleeping gods, quietly folded in on itself, leaving behind only tombs, only fragments, only a labyrinth, waiting patiently beneath the earth for whoever proved curious enough to return. That civilization would not arrive for centuries, perhaps millennia. The world above would need to forget almost everything about what lay beneath it before it was ready to stumble back into contact with the same forces that had unmade the Pthumerians in the first place. But forget it did, and in that long quiet gap between one civilization's ruin and the next one's arrival, the stage was set for a modern city to rise directly above the old queen's tomb, carrying her name forward into a future she never could have imagined for herself. It's worth noting, before we leave this ancient period behind entirely, that almost nothing here is stated to us plainly by the game itself. This entire account is stitched together from item descriptions, from environmental storytelling, from the kind of archaeology only the most dedicated players undertake. One possible reading of this design choice is that From Software wanted the ancient Pthumerian era to feel genuinely lost, genuinely unreachable, the way real deep history often does, filtered through pottery shards and half-translated inscriptions rather than clean, authoritative textbooks. Another possible reading suggests something more thematic, that a story about the danger of understanding too much should itself resist being fully understood, that the gaps in our knowledge of Loren and Ihil and Is are the point rather than an oversight to be filled in. Either way, what survives is enough to establish the pattern that the rest of this timeline will trace again and again. A civilization drawing near to something vast, gaining power and knowledge from that proximity, and eventually being consumed by the very closeness that made it great. The Pthumerians guarded the Great Ones and were undone by them. The scholars who come next will discover the Great Ones and be undone by them in turn. It's a cycle that repeats with almost mechanical precision, as though the game is quietly insisting this was never going to end any other way. The queen who bore Murgo would not live to see her name become a city, would not live to see cathedrals raised over a tragedy she alone truly understood. And there's something quietly devastating in that asymmetry between memory and truth that outlasts her by centuries. With the Pthumerians gone and their labyrinth sealed beneath centuries of accumulated earth and silence, the world above moved on in the way worlds do, indifferent to the tombs beneath it, unaware that the same hunger which consumed an entire ancient civilization was still down there, patiently waiting. It would take a new people, a new city, and a new generation of curious, ambitious scholars to disturb that silence again, and it's to the founding of that city, and to the school that would eventually go digging where no one else dared, that we turn next. Centuries passed above the buried ruins of Ihil and Loren, long enough that the world forgot what slept beneath it, and into that forgetting came a new city, a new lakeside school, and a new generation of scholars who were about to make the exact same mistake their unknown predecessors had made, only faster, and with considerably worse consequences for everyone involved. Modern humans, unaware of the Pthumerian civilization buried beneath their feet, built a city in the valley above the old labyrinth, and named it, almost accidentally, in honor of the queen whose tomb lay directly underneath their new streets. They called it Yharnam. Sometime later, in the woods to the city's west, on the shores of a large lake, a school was established that would come to define everything this timeline is really about. It was called Byrgenwerth College, and its founding feels, in hindsight, almost quaint compared to what it would eventually unleash. Across the water, on an island to the northwest, human nobility built a very different kind of institution, Canehurst Castle, a seat of aristocratic power that would, in its own time, develop an obsession with blood every bit as consuming as anything Byrgenwerth's scholars ever produced. For a while, these two institutions existed in parallel, one devoted to inquiry and one to bloodline, and there's no strong indication in the game's texts that either paid the other much attention in these earliest years, each pursuing its own separate notion of what mattered most. That changed the moment Byrgenwerth's scholars found a way into the old Pthumerian labyrinth sleeping beneath Yharnam, and it's worth naming the people responsible for that discovery. because their names will recur constantly across every remaining chapter of this timeline. The expedition was led by Provost Willem, a man whose thirst for knowledge would come to define an entire school of thought, and it included among its ranks 3 students whose futures would diverge in ways none of them could have predicted standing at that entrance together. Lawrence was one of them, destined to become the founder of an institution that would reshape the entire city above. Michaelash was another, destined to chase a very different, much darker thread of research into a village most Yharnamites would eventually learn to fear by name. Carol rounded out this trio of students, and while her later path receives less direct attention in the game's texts than her companions, her name would go on to be attached to an entire language of arcane symbols, still used by hunters generations after her. What Willem and his students found beneath the earth was not treasure in any conventional sense. It was a source of something called the Old Blood, a substance whose properties seemed, at first encounter, almost miraculous, and whose existence pointed towards something far larger than any of them expected. By extension, in discovering this blood, the scholars also discovered the truth of the Great Ones, the alien beings from whom this blood ultimately originated, and it's hard to overstate how thoroughly this discovery reoriented the entire purpose of Byrgenwerth as an institution going forward. Spurred by what they'd found, the scholars didn't simply catalog the blood and move on. They began researching ways to accelerate humanity's evolution, to help the species as a whole ascend toward the same plane of existence the Great Ones themselves occupied. It's worth pausing here to notice how quickly the language shifts, from careful academic inquiry into something closer to religious ambition, a shift that mirrors almost exactly what happened to the Thumerians so many centuries earlier, though none of these scholars seem to know that history at all. Around this same period, a runesmith named Carol began the work of transcribing the inhuman whispers of the Great Ones into symbols that would come to bear her name, even though, as later scholarship makes clear, not every rune credited to her was actually her own creation. Carol's ultimate fate is never confirmed anywhere in the game's surviving texts. She appears to have died, or perhaps simply left Byrgenwerth behind entirely, and the ambiguity itself feels appropriate for a woman whose life's work was giving human shape to something fundamentally inhuman. Not everyone at Byrgenwerth kept their discoveries within the walls of the school, and this is where the story's first real betrayal enters the timeline. A betrayal that would end up reshaping Cainhurst Castle every bit as thoroughly as the original discovery had reshaped Byrgenwerth itself. An unnamed scholar, for reasons the game never fully explains, took what the texts describe as forbidden blood, and carried it across the water to Cainhurst, delivering it directly into the hands of the castle's reigning queen. A decision that would echo for generations. Queen Annalise of Cainhurst, upon imbibing this stolen blood, acquired what the game's item descriptions describe as complete immortality, becoming the very first of what would later be known across Yharnam as the Vile Bloods, a bloodline defined as much by ambition as by biology. Annalise did not stop at her own transformation. She sent her royal guards out into the surrounding lands to collect what the texts call blood dregs, driven by a hope that seems, on its surface, almost tender, the desire to conceive what she called a child of blood. One possible reading of Annalise's ambition is that she wanted something the Great Ones themselves seemed to withhold from ordinary reproduction, a way of passing her newfound power down through an actual bloodline, rather than letting it end with her alone in that cold castle. Whatever her exact motivations, the consequences of this theft would not remain contained to Cainhurst. The existence of the Vile Bloods would eventually draw the attention of forces in Yharnam far less interested in royal ambition and far more interested in extermination. Back at Byrgenwerth, the scholars' research pushed them toward increasingly dangerous territory, and it was this pressure that led to one of the timeline's darkest early episodes. A massacre carried out not by monsters, but by 2 of the school's own most trusted agents. The scholars had learned of a great one they knew by the name Kos, resting near a distant settlement called the Fishing Hamlet, and they dispatched 2 people to retrieve whatever useful material could be recovered from such extraordinary proximity to an actual physical god. Those 2 agents were Gehrman, a skilled craftsman whose name will anchor much of this timeline's middle chapters, and Lady Maria, an estranged relative of Queen Annalise herself, whose own path would diverge dramatically from her family's growing obsession with blood. The duo's method of retrieval was brutal in a way the game never softens or excuses. They slaughtered the hamlet's residents on their way to Kos's resting place, forcibly searching the skulls of the dead and dying for what the texts describe as eyes on the inside. Once they reached Kos herself, they discovered something neither of them could have anticipated: an unborn child, a Great One's fetus still resting within her. An entity that would later become known to hunters as the Orphan of Kos, and would carry consequences forward for decades. Gehrman and Maria brought this fetus back to Byrgenwerth, though Maria, by every account we have, was disgusted by what she'd just participated in. On the return journey, she threw her own weapon, the Rakuyo, down the hamlet's well and swore off hunting entirely. It's a small gesture, throwing away a weapon into a well, but it carries enormous weight for a woman whose later story becomes almost entirely defined by guilt. And it's the first clear sign in this timeline that not every scholar shared Byrgenwerth's growing appetite for this kind of violence. At Byrgenwerth itself, Provost Willem dissected the fetus they'd brought back, extracting from it an eldritch artifact the texts call the Cord of the Eye, sometimes described as 1/3 of an umbilical cord, an object that would go on to matter enormously in chapters still ahead of us. The fishing hamlet did not simply absorb this atrocity without consequence. The surviving fishkin, along with Kos herself, placed a curse on Gehrman, on Maria, and on every hunter who would come after them, a curse condemning all current and future hunters to succumb to bloodlust. This curse also bound them to be drawn eventually into what the game calls the Hunter's Nightmare, and it's worth remembering this detail closely, because it will resurface directly when we reach the chapter of this timeline devoted entirely to the old hunters. Another quiet detail appears when you look at this curse and notice how thoroughly it frames every hunter we ever play as in the base game as, in some sense, an unwitting inheritor of a crime committed generations before their birth, one they had no part in choosing. Back within Byrgenwerth's walls, the pressures of this research inevitably produced fracture, and the fracture that emerged here would prove to be one of the most consequential splits in the entire history of Yharnam, reshaping the city for centuries after it happened. Master Willem believed humanity's ascension should come through insight, through what the texts describe as lining one's brain with eyes, a path oriented toward pure knowledge and pure perception, rather than any physical transformation of the body itself. Lawrence, one of Willem's own former students, contended instead that ascension should come through imbibing the old blood directly, a path oriented toward the body, toward physical transformation, toward something considerably more visceral than Willem's preferred method of careful contemplation. These two visions proved irreconcilable. What began as an academic disagreement between mentor and student hardened over time into something closer to an ideological rupture, one that would eventually split Byrgenwerth's community in two and send half of it out into the world entirely. Lawrence left, and he did not leave alone. Michaelash went with him, as did Gehrman and Lady Maria, along with an unknown number of students whose individual names history does not preserve, though their departure marks the true end of Byrgenwerth's unified era. Crucially, this group did not leave empty-handed. They took with them the college's source of the old blood itself, the very substance that had started this entire chain of discovery, meaning the fracture at Byrgenwerth was not just ideological but material, practical, immediate in its consequences. It's worth sitting with the shape of this schism for a moment, because it maps almost perfectly onto a tension the rest of this timeline will keep circling back to: knowledge versus flesh, perception versus transformation, the eye versus the blood, as two competing visions of what it means to become more than human. Willem, left behind at Byrgenwerth with his half of the community, would continue pursuing his own vision of ascension in relative isolation. And the fruits of that isolated pursuit will matter enormously later in this timeline, though their full consequences wouldn't become clear for a very long time. Lawrence, meanwhile, carried his half of the schism and the stolen old blood directly toward the city of Yharnam itself, setting the stage for the founding of an institution that would come to dominate every subsequent chapter of this story we're telling. One possible reading of this whole period is that Byrgenwerth's tragedy was never really about villainy in any simple sense, but about two sincerely held convictions about human potential that simply could not coexist within a single institution, and had to eventually tear that institution apart. None of the people involved in these early events set out with anything like malice. Willem wanted knowledge, Lawrence wanted healing, Annalise, in her own strange way, wanted a child. And yet from these very human wants, something considerably less human was already beginning to take shape across the whole city. What began as a quiet school beside a quiet lake had, within the span of one generation, produced an immortal queen, a cursed lineage of hunters, a fractured community of scholars, and the stolen blood that would soon give birth to an entire church built on it. Gehrman, who had once slaughtered innocents alongside Maria in service of Byrgenwerth's research, now found himself walking away from the institution that shaped him, carrying a burden of guilt he would spend the rest of his long, strange existence trying to set down. Mikolash, for his part, carried something different away from Byrgenwerth than either Gehrman or Maria did. A fixation that would eventually calcify into an obsession so total, it would consume not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who followed him into his later research. As Lawrence made his way toward Yharnam proper, carrying the stolen old blood and a vision of ascension through the body, the city he was walking into had no idea that its own transformation was only just beginning to take shape around him. Two paths, split from a single origin point, were now moving forward in parallel, each certain of its own righteousness, each unaware of just how thoroughly the other's failures would eventually come to depend on and reflect its own across the years still ahead. And so, with the schism complete, and the old blood now flowing toward a city that had no defenses against what it was about to receive, we leave Byrgenwerth behind for now, though we will return to it, again and again, as its consequences keep surfacing throughout everything that follows. For now, our attention turns toward Yharnam itself, toward the cathedral Lawrence was about to raise, and toward the church that would soon become the most powerful institution in the entire city, built, whether anyone wanted to admit it, on a foundation of stolen blood and irreconcilable ambition. Lawrence arrived in Yharnam carrying two things that would define the next century of the city's history: a body of stolen research into the old blood, and a conviction hardened by schism that humanity's salvation lay in the body rather than in the eye, and from those two things an entire church would soon rise. He didn't waste time. Lawrence started the Healing Church in Yharnam and became its first vicar, a title that would carry enormous weight for generations of Yharnamites who came after him, most of whom would never fully understand what the church's founder had actually left Byrgenwerth carrying. The Grand Cathedral rose north of the city under his direction, an architectural statement as much as a religious one, a building meant to announce that something new and powerful had taken root in Yharnam, something considerably older and stranger than it appeared from the street. What ordinary Yharnamites never saw, what remained hidden from the lay congregation praying beneath its arches, was a secret research hall built directly above the cathedral's nave, accessible only through a concealed elevator hidden behind the altar itself, in full view and yet entirely unseen. It was here, in this hidden hall above the heads of unsuspecting worshippers, that Lady Maria continued the research she'd once helped conduct at Byrgenwerth, carrying her scholarly work forward even as her personal relationship to hunting had already fractured beyond repair. Mikolash, meanwhile, chose not to follow Lawrence into the city proper. He continued his own studies independently at Yahar Gul, a settlement that would come to be known as the Unseen Village, a name that already tells you something about the direction his research was heading. His students there eventually organized themselves into what would become known as the School of Mensis, and this new institution developed its own dark practice, secretly sending hunters and creatures called Snatchers out into the world to procure test subjects for whatever experiments Mikolash had in mind. With the church now established and its hidden research underway, Lawrence needed a public-facing purpose, something that would justify the institution's existence to the ordinary people of Yharnam who had no idea what was happening above their cathedral's own altar. The church found that purpose in what it called blood ministration. Promoted publicly as a panacea, capable of curing virtually any disease, and word of its healing power spread quickly, drawing the sick and desperate to Yharnam from what the texts suggest were considerable distances. In reality, blood ministration served a dual purpose that the ordinary sick people receiving it never suspected. It let the church continue studying the properties of the old blood on an enormous, ongoing scale, using the entire population of the sick as an unwitting research base. There was, however, an unintended consequence buried inside this arrangement, one the church hadn't fully anticipated when it began administering blood on such a massive scale to so many people across the city, and that consequence would prove considerably harder to control than anyone expected. The Scourge of the Beast, that same transformation first witnessed centuries earlier in ancient Loren, began to re-emerge among the people of Yharnam, a direct side effect of the old blood's power finally making itself known within the very city meant to benefit from it. When the first Yharnamites began transforming into beasts under this new wave of exposure, it fell to Gehrman, the same man who had once helped retrieve Kossa's unborn child at the fishing hamlet, to organize a response. And it was in this moment that he established his own workshop, Gehrman became the first true hunter, and his pupils operated quietly, under cover of darkness, disposing of transformed beasts before the general population could grasp the full scale of what was happening within their own city, a containment strategy built almost entirely on secrecy. It wasn't only beasts these early hunters dealt with. The texts suggest they were also used to dispose of other, non-beast threats to the church's growing power, with the beast crisis itself serving as convenient justification for removing whatever obstacles stood in the institution's way. Around this same period, the church turned its attention toward a threat it perceived as considerably more dangerous than any beast, the vile bloods of Cainhurst, whose existence had by now become known to church officials with access to considerably more information than ordinary Yharnamites. The response was swift and total. The church formed a cadre of fanatics known as the Executioners, whose sole purpose was hunting down and eliminating the vile blood threat entirely, and they moved on Cainhurst Castle with an intensity that left almost nothing standing in their wake. The Executioners stormed the castle and slaughtered nearly everyone inside. A massacre carried out with a kind of totality that suggests the church viewed the vile bloods not as rivals to be managed, but as an existential contamination to be purged from the world entirely. Only their leader, a man named Logarius, survived long enough to reach Queen Annalise herself, and what followed was not a simple execution but something considerably stranger. Because Annalise's stolen immortality meant that killing her in any conventional sense simply wasn't possible. Unable to end her existence outright, Logarius chose instead to martyr himself, sealing Annalise away rather than destroying her, a decision that would leave the Vileblood Queen trapped rather than truly defeated, waiting in isolation for a future none of the executioners could have predicted. The uniforms worn by the executioners during this massacre, particularly the shawl worn by Logarius himself, went on to become the visual template for every subsequent church garb worn by hunters and clerics alike, meaning the iconography of hunting itself traces directly back to this one bloody purge. It's worth pausing on that detail, because it means every hunter we later encounter wearing church attire is, whether they know it or not, wearing a design lineage born from the systematic extermination of an entire noble house, a quiet detail worth noticing. While the church consolidated its power through blood ministration and purged its rivals through the executioners, a very different tragedy was unfolding within its own secret research hall, one involving the woman who had once sworn off hunting after the horror of the fishing hamlet. Lady Maria's guilt over that massacre had never truly left her, and it was compounded further by repeated failures in her research on what the texts call brain fluid. Failures that seemed to weigh on her more heavily with each passing year of continued fruitless study. Unable to cope any longer with the accumulated weight of guilt and professional failure together, Lady Maria took her own life, slitting her own throat in an act the game never dwells on graphically, but treats with unmistakable gravity across every subsequent reference to her. Gehrman, who had known her since their shared days at Byrgenwerth and their shared crime at the fishing hamlet, spiraled into a depression the texts describe without much ambiguity, and in his grief he created something that would come to define the rest of his existence. He built the plain doll, crafted in Maria's image, a figure that would go on to serve as companion and caretaker to generations of hunters drawn into the dream that Gehrman was about to help create, carrying forward some echo of the woman he'd lost. It was in this period of grief and continued research that Vicar Lawrence, working alongside Gehrman as his closest associate, procured another Cord of the Eye. The same kind of artifact Willem had once extracted from the Orphan of Kos back at Byrgenwerth. Using this cord, they beckoned something the texts call the Nameless Moon Presence, sometimes referred to simply as the Pale Moon, and whatever deal was struck between Lawrence's church and this entity is never spelled out to us in full, though its consequences reshaped everything that followed. One possible reading of this deal is that it was meant to address multiple problems at once, a cure for the scourge, and perhaps some way of addressing the grief and loss that had already begun accumulating around Gehrman and Lawrence both, in ways the texts only gesture toward. Whatever the deal's exact terms, Gehrman was taken from the waking world entirely, drawn into a newly created space the game calls the Hunter's Dream, where he was to oversee its function and guide future hunters, who would themselves be drawn into this same sustained liminal space. The doll was given a semblance of life within this new dream, finally granted the ability to move and speak and care for hunters in a way that honored, however imperfectly, the woman she'd been crafted to resemble, a quiet mercy inside an otherwise cold arrangement. Seemingly as part of whatever bargain had been struck, Gehrman was meant to wait within this dream for Lawrence to find some way of rescuing him back into the waking world, a promise that, as later chapters of this timeline will make painfully clear, was never actually fulfilled. In Gehrman's absence from the waking world, his old workshop, the one he'd founded to quietly dispose of Yharnam's early beasts, fell into disrepair, its methods and its secrecy no longer maintained by the man who had built the entire operation around his own particular caution. Around this same period, a separate and unrelated thread enters the timeline, one that would eventually give rise to an organization operating almost entirely outside the church's authority, guided by its own particular understanding of the threats facing Yharnam. A group of foreign constables, pursuing a beast that had wandered into their jurisdiction, chased it all the way to Yharnam, and in the fight that followed, all but one of them perished. That survivor, a man named Valter, devoured the beast's corpse, and this act granted him something unusual, the ability to perceive what the texts call vermin within human blood, a kind of corruption invisible to ordinary sight. Valter used this newfound perception to found the League of Confederates, an organization dedicated entirely to discovering and crushing this vermin wherever it appeared. Operating with a mandate considerably narrower and stranger than the church's own broader campaign against beasts and vile bloods alike. The League would go on to occupy a strange marginal place in Yharnam's broader history, neither fully aligned with the church's authority nor entirely opposed to it, pursuing its own particular understanding of corruption in ways that rarely overlapped cleanly with the concerns of the institutions around it. Looking back across this entire period, from Lawrence's founding of the church to Valter's founding of the League, what stands out most is how many separate, semi-independent power structures Yharnam had already accumulated within just a few generations of Byrgenwerth's original schism. The church held public authority and hidden research both. The School of Mensis pursued its own separate obsession out at Yahar'gul. The League operated according to its own private logic entirely, and Cainhurst, though gutted by the executioners, still held its sealed queen within its walls. This fragmentation matters enormously for understanding everything still ahead of us, because Bloodborne's later chapters aren't the story of one institution's clean rise and fall, but of several overlapping, often mutually ignorant institutions all pursuing incompatible visions of the same underlying mystery, a pattern that only deepens from here. Gehrman's workshop, meanwhile, sat dormant, its founder trapped in a dream he'd entered on the promise of eventual rescue, waiting for a vicar who, as we'll see, had already moved his attention toward other pressing matters that would soon consume the city itself. Even as the Grand Cathedral kept growing in influence, its true purpose still hidden from the worshippers filling its pews each week. Lady Maria's death, though it occurred quietly within a secret research hall few Yharnamites even knew existed, would go on to echo across the rest of this timeline in ways she likely never intended, her image preserved not in memory, but in the very doll meant to comfort her successors. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the plain doll's placid, unchanging expression across every hunter's visit to the dream, and notice that she was built, quite literally, out of someone's grief, a fact the game never states outright, but never quite lets you forget either. The curse laid upon Gehrman and Maria at the fishing hamlet, the one condemning all hunters to eventual bloodlust and the nightmare beyond it, had not gone away simply because Gehrman now resided in a different, dream-bound existence. If anything, it had only grown more entangled with his new role, a detail that will matter considerably once we reach the game's final confrontation, since the dream isn't neutral ground, but the product of a costly bargain struck between a grieving vicar and something that called itself the Moon. For now, though, Yharnam's church continued growing, its workshop dormant, its vicar aging, and its secret research proceeding quietly above the heads of a congregation that had no idea their salvation was being purchased through means considerably darker than anything preached from the pulpit below. The city itself, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of everything we've just covered: the schism at Byrgenwerth, the theft at Cainhurst, the massacre at the executioner's hands, and the quiet tragedy of a woman who threw her weapon down a well and never picked one up again. What ordinary Yharnamites did notice, increasingly, was the return of something they thought their new church had already solved: the scourge itself. Resurfacing not in some distant ancient city like Loren, but in the very streets beneath the cathedral, meant to protect them from exactly this fate. That resurgence, and the specific district of the city where it would hit hardest, deserves its own dedicated attention, because what happened next in Old Yharnam would go on to shape hunter culture, church policy, and the physical geography of the city for every generation that followed it. It's to that tragedy, the burning of an entire district, and the birth of a very different kind of hunter in response to it, that we turn our attention next, carrying forward everything we now know about the church, the dream, and the curse, quietly binding them all together. Every city carries at least one wound it never quite recovers from, and for Yharnam, that wound has a name, a location, and a smell of ash that, according to certain item descriptions, still clings faintly to its ruins even generations after the fires that created them finally burned out. The trouble began, as it so often did in this city, with disease. A deadly illness the texts call ashen blood began spreading through the district that would eventually become known simply as Old Yharnam, a name that only makes sense once you understand what happened to earn it. Traditional medicine, whatever passed for it among ordinary Yharnamites at the time, proved entirely ineffective against this new sickness. And as the disease spread and the death toll climbed, pressure mounted on the one institution everyone assumed could actually help, the healing church itself. The church responded the only way it knew how, carrying out blood ministration on a scale considerably larger than anything attempted before, treating the entire afflicted district with the same old blood that had already, quietly, begun causing problems elsewhere in the city without most people noticing. The results were, predictably to anyone who understands what we've already covered about the old blood side effects, catastrophic. Scores of old Yharnamites, having received this mass treatment, began transforming into beasts, and the district descended into exactly the kind of horror the church claimed to be curing. The blood moon rose again over the city, a recurrence of the same phenomenon first witnessed in ancient Loren and again during the earlier stirrings of the scourge within Yharnam proper, though this time the scale of transformation happening in one concentrated district was considerably worse. Gehrman's original workshop, the one he'd founded to quietly contain beasts before his own departure into the dream, was in no position to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. With its founder gone and its methods no longer actively maintained, the workshop found itself in disarray precisely when it was needed most. Into this vacuum stepped a new organization entirely, one built around a philosophy almost opposite to Gehrman's original approach. The church established what came to be known as the Oto Workshop, sending these new hunters into Old Yharnam in place of the absent original workshop's remaining pupils. These new hunters would eventually become known by a different, more evocative name, the Powder Kegs. And the name itself tells you almost everything you need to know about how they chose to operate, because subtlety was never part of their strategy in the first place. Where Gehrman's original hunters had worked quietly, disposing of beasts under cover of darkness to avoid public panic, the Powder Kegs eschewed that entire clandestine approach in favor of unsubtle, high-powered weaponry, embracing firepower and spectacle where their predecessors had embraced secrecy and restraint. It's worth pausing on that contrast for a moment, because it marks a genuine philosophical split within hunter culture itself, one that would echo forward through every subsequent generation of hunters, contain quietly, or burn loudly, and Old Yharnam is where the second approach was truly born. Even with this new, more aggressive strategy, the Powder Kegs found themselves unable to stem the tide of transformation sweeping through the district. The scourge had already spread too far, consumed too many people, and no amount of firepower seemed capable of containing it through combat alone. Faced with a crisis that combat could no longer solve, the Powder Kegs made a decision that would define Old Yharnam for every generation that followed. They resorted to fire, burning the district to the ground in an effort to finally definitively stop the scourge's spread across the rest of the city. The strategy worked, in the narrow sense that it stopped the immediate crisis, but it worked at a cost that the game never lets you forget once you actually walk through the charred ruins that resulted. Ruins that remain sealed off from the rest of Yharnam to this very day. The charred remains of Old Yharnam were formally sealed away from the rest of the city, a decision that reads simultaneously as public health measure and as a kind of collective forgetting, a way of physically walling off a tragedy too large for the city to process any other way. Among the hunters who fought alongside the Powder Kegs during this crisis was a man named Jura, and his story, more than almost anyone else's connected to this tragedy, captures the particular moral weight that the burning of Old Yharnam placed on everyone who took part in it. During the height of the outbreak, Jura was drawn into the hunter's dream, guided there by Gehrman himself, even in his diminished, dream-bound state, becoming one more hunter added to the growing roster of people Gehrman would come to oversee across his long, strange tenure. After the burning was complete, after the fires had done what combat alone couldn't, Jura found himself consumed by guilt over what he and the powder kegs had participated in, guilt that would come to define the entire remainder of his existence going forward. Unable to continue living with what he'd done, Jura asked Gehrman to sever him from the hunter's dream entirely, a request Gehrman granted, allowing Jura to return to the physical ruins of old Yharnam rather than remain bound to a dream shaped by the very tragedy he'd helped cause. Jura spent the remainder of his days caring for whatever beasts had managed to survive the fire. A quiet act of penance that stands in stark contrast to almost every other hunter's story we encounter across this entire timeline, most of which end in violence rather than tenderness. Of Jura's companions from this period, the texts tell us that one chose to stay with him in the ruins, sharing in his self-imposed exile and his quiet care for the surviving beasts, while another was drawn instead into the hunter's nightmare, a fate we'll examine more closely later. This split, one companion choosing penance and another being pulled into the nightmare, mirrors almost exactly the broader pattern this timeline keeps returning to. For every hunter who finds some form of peace or atonement, another seems destined to be consumed by the very curse binding them all together. With old Yharnam finally contained and sealed, Gehrman's original workshop was formally retired as well, a quiet administrative end to an institution that had once been the city's primary line of defense against the scourge, now rendered obsolete by the very crisis it failed to prevent. Many of the techniques and weapons developed during the original workshop's operation were lost entirely in this retirement, an irreplaceable body of hunting knowledge that simply vanished from active use, leaving future hunters to rediscover or reinvent solutions their predecessors had already worked out generations earlier. The Odo workshop and the powder kegs, despite having ultimately stopped the scourge's spread through old Yharnam, were denounced as heretics by the Healing Church for the methods they'd employed, a betrayal that reads as particularly bitter once you consider they'd done exactly what the crisis demanded of them. One possible reading of this denunciation is that the Church, having failed to contain the crisis through its own preferred methods, needed someone to blame for the district's destruction, and the powder kegs, with their loud and visible tactics, made for considerably easier scapegoats than the Church's own quiet mistakes. Another possible reading suggests the Church genuinely objected to the philosophy the powder kegs represented, a public, unsubtle approach to hunting that threatened to expose exactly the kind of secrecy the Church had spent generations carefully maintaining around its own blood ministration practices. Whatever the true motivation behind the denunciation, the powder kegs continued operating on the margins of Church authority from this point forward, a tradition of unsubtle, explosive hunting that would persist for generations, entirely separate from and often at odds with the Church's own preferred hunters. Meanwhile, the aging Vicar Lawrence, the same man who had founded the Church, raised the Grand Cathedral, and helped beckon the Moon Presence into an arrangement with Gehrman, found himself grappling with the scourge's persistence in a way his own institution seemed powerless to stop. Lawrence created and memorized something the texts call the Beast's Embrace Rune, an attempt, we can infer, to gain some direct control over the very transformation his church's practices had helped unleash across the city, a final act of research from a man nearing the end of his own long career. The attempt did not go the way Lawrence intended. Rather than granting him control over the scourge, the rune's use transformed him instead, turning the church's own first vicar into what the game recognizes as the very first cleric beast, a transformation as ironic as it is tragic. Lawrence, the man who had founded an institution promising healing to an entire city, had to be put down himself, killed by hunters carrying out the exact same duty his own church had trained them for. A closing of the loop that the game presents without any particular sentimentality. It's worth sitting with that irony for a moment, because Lawrence's fate encapsulates almost everything this timeline has been building toward across its first several chapters. A man who sought ascension through blood, who split from Byrgenwerth over exactly this conviction, ultimately consumed by the very thing he championed. Despite losing its founder in this manner, the Healing Church did not collapse or falter in any lasting way. If anything, its growth continued largely undisturbed by Lawrence's death, a testament to how thoroughly the institution had already embedded itself into every level of Yharnam's civic life. The Church, in Lawrence's absence, became the de facto governing body of Yharnam entirely. No longer just a religious institution offering healing to the sick, but the actual center of civic power, controlling public life in ways that extended well beyond anything resembling traditional religious authority. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly the Church's rise mirrors the Thumerian civilization's own arc from the very first chapter of this timeline. a guardian institution gradually consumed by the very forces it was meant to protect people from, generation after generation. Old Yharnam itself, sealed and charred, would remain a physical scar on the city's geography for the rest of this timeline, a place hunters would eventually need to descend into again, drawn by echoes of the original tragedy that the sealing was never quite able to fully contain. The beasts Jura continued to protect within those ruins represented in their own strange way the last living remnant of an entire district's population, transformed beyond recognition but not entirely erased, kept alive by one man's quiet refusal to see them only as monsters requiring extermination. It's a perspective almost nobody else in this timeline shares. Every other institution we've covered, the church, the executioners, the league, the powder kegs themselves, approaches the scourge as a problem to be solved through violence, and Jura's quiet care stands as the timeline's rare exception to that rule. The philosophical split introduced here between quiet containment and loud explosive purging would continue shaping hunter culture for generations, resurfacing again and again as different institutions and different individual hunters chose their own particular answer to the same underlying question of how to handle the scourge. With old Yharnam sealed and Lawrence dead, the church now stood as Yharnam's unquestioned governing authority, its origins in schism and stolen research increasingly obscured by generations of ordinary worshippers who knew the institution only through its public face of healing and civic order. That public face, however, concealed research that had only grown more ambitious in the years following Lawrence's death, research that would soon require an entirely new kind of hunter, one recruited and trained directly by the church itself, rather than inherited from Gehrman's original, now-retired workshop. It's to the founding of this new church workshop, and to the hunter chosen to lead it, that our attention turns next, carrying forward everything we now know about the cost of unsubtle solutions, the irony of a founder consumed by his own creation, and the quiet scar old Yharnam left on the city. Before we move forward, though, it's worth naming plainly what this chapter has actually demonstrated, because it's easy to get lost in the individual tragedies of Jura, Lawrence, and the powder kegs without noticing the larger pattern all three of their stories are quietly reinforcing together. Every attempt to contain the scourge in this timeline, whether through Gehrman's original quiet secrecy or the powder keg's loud and explosive fire, has so far succeeded only at tremendous cost, suggesting the scourge itself may be less a problem with a solution than a condition Yharnam simply has to live with. That suggestion will only grow stronger as this timeline continues. And it's worth carrying it forward consciously into the chapters ahead, because the church's next major undertaking, the establishment of its own dedicated workshop, represents yet another attempt to solve a problem that may never actually have a clean solution.